Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Perspectives, where we take a look at current events through the lens of American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. In this episode, we focus on presidential State of the Union addresses. Just last week, President Donald Trump gave a speech to a joint session of Congress, technically not a State of the Union address, but really that's a distinction without a difference. It had all the flavors of a State of the Union, and it turns out these speeches are more than just an American tradition. It's a constitutional requirement going back to Article 2, Section 3, which says, "He, the President, shall from time to time give to the Congress information of the State of the Union and recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient." In this episode, we'll go back and review some of the trends in these State of the Union addresses, also some of the most momentous speeches as well. And we're going to start, of course, at the beginning with the nation's first president, George Washington, who set so many precedents in his term in office, beginning with his first annual message to Congress. That's what the State of the Union was called for many, many years. It's January 8th of 1790, and Washington delivered a mix of sort of high-level patriotic oratory along with some practical areas that were going to be focused for his administration. Like national defense, Washington said to be prepared for war is one of the most effectual means of preserving peace. He talked about the importance of education in a republic. Knowledge is in every country the surest basis of public happiness, he said. He went on to talk about Indian relations, foreign affairs, immigration policy, a variety of other topics, and eventually concluded the welfare of our country is the greatest object to which our cares and effort ought to be directed, and I shall derive great satisfaction from a cooperation with you, the Congress, in the pleasing though arduous task of ensuring to our fellow citizens the blessings which they have a right to expect from a free, efficient, and equal government. Kind of the somewhat flowery tones that you would often hear in annual messages or State of the Unions. Washington has definitely established a pattern of the kind of speech, the topics that would be discussed, even the timing. It was given at the beginning of January. In this case, most of them would come at the beginning of December to coincide with the new seating of a new Congress. Now, Washington delivered all 8 of his annual messages in person, as did John Adams, the nation's second president, and one of those was a really significant one. This is 1798. Most people expected that Adams would use this as an opportunity to ask Congress for a declaration of war against France. John Adams got to that point in the speech, and he surprised a lot of people. He pivoted. He said, you know what? We'll take one more shot at diplomacy. Adams said, and with a sincere disposition on the part of France to desist from hostility, to make reparation for the injuries heretofore inflicted upon our commerce, and to do justice in the future, there will be no obstacle to the restoration of a friendly intercourse. Now, this speech, which did lead to avoiding the war with France, actually blew up the Federalist Party. It ruined Adams' chance for re-election, but again, it did help to avoid war as he followed up with diplomatic effort instead of that declaration of war. Now, for next president, Thomas Jefferson, he decided to change things up a little bit. Jefferson did not like public speeches. In fact, in his 2 terms as president, 8 years in total, he gave only 2 public speeches the entire time, and those were his 2 inaugural addresses. He decided to take the annual message and go into written form, something he was much more comfortable with, and he decided to do that and started a new trend. Also in that first one for him, this is 1801, some relevance for some of the topics he was talking about. He wanted to shrink the size of the federal government. He said at the time that among those who are dependent on executive discretion, I have begun the reduction of what was deemed unnecessary. Several agencies created by executive authorities on salaries fixed by that also have been suppressed. Other reformations of the same kind will be pursued with that caution which is requisite in removing useless things, not to injure what is retained, but the great mass of public offices is established by law, and therefore by law alone can be abolished. He was acknowledging he could only go so far in reducing the size of the federal government without authorization from Congress. Again, a topic that's very much relevant to what's going on today. The next 23 presidents followed Jefferson's lead, and they submitted their annual messages as written messages. They would be read by a clerk to the House and the Senate. Often these were sort of lengthy series of reports prepared by cabinet secretaries with lots of details. There were also some policy initiatives that were focused on in these speeches kind of for the coming year. One of the most famous policy initiatives came in 1823. This is the presidency of James Monroe, who introduced in his annual message of that year the doctrine that bears his name. He had a warning for Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. According to Monroe, the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintained, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers, and to declare that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. The Monroe Doctrine was born in one of these annual messages. Now, one of the messages in the upcoming administrations was delayed by 2 months, not because of anything the president did, but because the House of Representatives hadn't yet organized itself. This is in 1858. The president is Franklin Pierce. He's dealing with the North and South battles in bleeding Kansas. He's got his annual message ready to go, but there had just been a midterm election. And it turns out that the House was evenly divided. They couldn't pick a speaker, and they went on for weeks and weeks. And frankly, after 2 months, Pierce said, I'm not waiting anymore. I'm going to send my message just to the Senate. He did, and he talked about what was going on in the country, this North-South divide that he very much laid at the blame of the North. According to Franklin Pierce, if one state ceases to respect the rights of another and obtrusively intermeddles with its local interests, talking about slavery, we are no longer unified friendly states, but distracted hostile ones. While the southern states confine their attention to their own affairs, too many inhabitants of the northern states are permanently organized in associations to inflict injury on the former by wrongful acts. He had a warning for his fellow Americans that this either has to stop or it could end in civil war. We move to the next president, an even more momentous speech. This is James Buchanan. It's December of 1860. Abraham Lincoln has just been elected. There is talk of secession, and people want to know, what is the current president, James Buchanan, going to do about it? Well, Buchanan, in his annual message, he looked very carefully at the Constitution and gave a legal definition of what he thought of secession. According to Buchanan, in order to justify secession as a constitutional remedy, it must be on the principle that the federal government is a mere voluntary association of states, to be dissolved at pleasure by any one of the contracting parties. If this be so, this confederacy is a rope of sand to be penetrated and dissolved by the first adverse wave of public opinion in any of the states. It is not pretended that any clause in the Constitution gives countenance to such a theory. Secession is not an inherent constitutional right. Secession is neither more nor less than revolution. The problem was, as Buchanan continued in his speech, he said, you know what? Secession may be unconstitutional, but the president, according to the Constitution, doesn't have any authority to stop it. For this sort of convoluted statement, Buchanan was ridiculed. A lot of people saying, look, this is hardly the leadership that the nation needed at this time, as he ended his term on a very difficult note, because secession followed almost immediately thereafter, 7 states walking out before Abraham Lincoln even took his oath of office. Let's jump ahead. 1887, President Grover Cleveland used a very unusual annual message, the only one in American history that focused on only one topic. That topic, also highly relevant to today, was the tariff. Grover Cleveland believed in a low tariff, just enough to run the federal government and keep people's money in their own pockets. That was his philosophy when it came to things like taxes and tariffs. According to Cleveland, in his annual message, only such deduction as may be his share toward the careful and economical maintenance of the government which protects him. It is plain that the exaction of more than this is indefensible extortion and a culpable betrayal of American fairness and justice. The wrong inflicted upon those who bear the burden of national taxation, like other wrongs, multiplies a brood of evil consequences. Cleveland felt strongly about this, but in both of his terms, he would actually lose more than he would win when it came to bringing that tariff down. The annual message changed forever in 1913. This is when a reporter suggested to the new President Woodrow Wilson, you know what, you're a noted orator, why don't you go back to what Washington and Adams did and deliver your annual message in person? Well, first, Wilson, he liked the idea, but he was balking at it. He said, I'm afraid it would be too radical. You know, there are certain things which simply can't be done the way you would like to do them. It would be such a shock to the sensibilities of the members of Congress, to their orthodox ideas. Didn't think it was a good idea. Then he changed his mind. He said, you know what? Let's go give this a try. And in fact, he did. He delivered his message in person to a joint session of Congress, and he called, by the way, for a reduction in the tariff. It's one of the things he talked about in that speech. He was thrilled at this in-person experience. In fact, he took a shot at his predecessor, Theodore Roosevelt, on the ride back to the White House with his wife, Ellen. He told Ellen, wouldn't Teddy have been glad to think of that? I put one over on Teddy that time and am totally happy. Wilson set a new precedent. Presidents ever since have been giving their annual message in person. The first annual message to go on the radio Calvin Coolidge, Silent Cal. This is 1923. It may have been Silent Cal. It was actually pretty effective on the radio, and so that was a change. January of 1936, Franklin Roosevelt took the message not only to radio, but to the evening. The first one to put that in the evening, kind of like one of his fireside chats. He wanted to get the biggest audience possible. He talked in that speech about sort of the united element of the Western Hemisphere, particularly North America, but he had a warning about what was going on. He said, "The rest of the world, there is the rub. A point has been reached where the people of the Americas must take cognizance of growing ill will, of marked trends toward aggression, of increasing armaments, of shortening tempers. A situation which has in many of the elements that lead to the tragedy of general war." This certainly was prescient. There was no war immediately yet in the world, but it was only a couple of years away. The annual message formally switched to be called the State of the Union Address in 1947. This is Harry Truman giving his speech, and this goes back to the language in the Constitution, talking about giving Congress the State of the Union. Well, that name went along with the speech going forward that Truman had as the first one to be televised. The television came along in 1947 for the State of the Union, and one of the things that Truman highlighted in his speech was a focus on civil rights. In fact, he told them that "I have therefore by executive order established the President's Committee on Civil Rights to study and report on the whole problem of federally secured civil rights with a view to making recommendations to the Congress." Truman got really behind this. Congress did not. Congress made it very divided on the topic, and so when the recommendations came forward, they sat on most of them, did not go forward. Truman did adopt some by executive authority, but some of the other ones were still stagnant. Well, that's pretty much up to date on the presidents that I have studied. Some of the famous State of the Union addresses going forward, you've got 1996 with Bill Clinton claiming that the era of big government is over. Fast forward to 2002, George W. Bush talking about the axis of evil, Iran, Iraq, and North Korea in the wake of the September 11th attack. But these are some of the topics that I'm going to get to in due time when I cover those presidents and then cover those speeches. For now, that is a look at the presidents and the State of the Union addresses. For more on some of these topics that we've talked about in this episode, check out some of the links in the description below. You can also check out my books on Amazon.com. Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Perspectives from Presidential Chronicles.